If you're interested in making money by flipping football cards, then this episode is for you. With the NFL season set to kick off this week, I thought this would be a great time to break down the football card market and to look at what football cards may go up and down in value this season. And more importantly, to talk about the strategies to make money off of football card flipping in general, because there are ways to do it. There are people out there that make quite a bit of money by buying and selling football cards. One of those people is Paul Hickey. Paul Hickey is the founder of the Sports Card Strategy Show podcast. He also has a website called nooffseason.com where he is constantly breaking down the football card market and pointing out opportunities to buy football cards at a low point and sell them at a high point. So I thought this would be a great show to bring Paul onto to preview this football season, to talk about the football card market in general. And then later in the episode, we're going to talk about the specific football cards that he thinks you could potentially purchase right now and make a lot of money off of as the season goes on. So without further ado, please welcome Paul Hickey to the Geoff Wilson Show. Welcome to the Geoff Wilson Show. We are about 24 hours away from football season, NFL season kicking off. How excited are you?
Geoff, I'm super pumped. It's my favorite time of the year, man, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you on. I know you kind of live and breathe football and football cards in particular. You have a podcast, Sports Card Strategy Show, and obviously a website, No Off Season. A lot of your focus is around football and football cards. Why are you so invested in that part of the hobby?
Well, I set out about 5 years ago on a mission to figure out a way to help people make money flipping sports cards. And while I'm into all sports, I've found over the last few years that football is the most consistent sport at allowing me to look at historical data and recognize patterns and have surefire lows and highs in the market. And so football is the most consistent out of all the sports at allowing me to identify buying markers and selling markers. And on top of that, I do have a background in fantasy football. And so kind of pairing together the patterns that I recognized in player performance spikes, where whenever a player outperforms their expectations, or whenever there's hype around a player, whether it's making a spectacular catch in like a preseason workout, or whether it's putting up a 3 or 4 touchdown game, whatever it may be, whenever that happens in fantasy football or in cards, the same pattern happens where it becomes harder to acquire that player. You need more capital to acquire that player after that happens. So, for those two reasons, like you said, I've dug deep into football cards and kind of made it a big focus at nooffseason.com.
And when you talk about the general market trends, I know one of those, just basic advice you hear in sports cards for a long time, which is buy in the off season and sell during the season itself, or maybe in the lead up to the season. Does that pattern, based on the data that you analyze, hold relatively true for football cards overall?
Relatively true, yes. But I always say this. It always depends on the card, and it depends on where you bought in for that card. So I don't like blanket statements. On the Sports Card Strategy Show and at nooffseason.com, I try to always be very, very, very specific. And if somebody asks me a question, I always try to ask, okay, well, what specific card are you talking about? When did you buy it? What price did you buy in at? What's your profit goal? All these things really matter. So generally, yes, it does hold true. And I've got some examples of that, but it doesn't hold true for all cards. And so you got to be very, very careful with the decisions you make when you buy in.
Yeah, for sure. Football has been an interesting sports card market in general over the last few years. I think that First of all, the growth that we've seen in football cards has been extreme. I mean, if you go back to 2019 and 2020, when the hype for sports cards in general was really, really, really building. I mean, when I started Sports Card Investor was in the summer of 2019, and that was right at the point when things really started to build, that latter half of 2019 into the early part of 2020. Of course, then the pandemic happens and fuels things even further. But originally, all of that hype back in 2019 and early 2020 was more centered around basketball cards. It seems like over the last few years, there's been a shift in dynamic where a lot of the ultra modern cards that are being most sought after, a lot of the cards that people are flipping at card shows, that people are chasing at the National, no matter what time of year it is, a lot of that interest is around football cards now. It wasn't the case as much 5 years ago. It seems very much like it's the case today. And I watch kids at these shows in particular. Of course, I have two sons who are very into cards, and I watch my older son Reeves and him going around these shows. And with him and all of the other kids, it's almost entirely football cards. Is that something kind of on an overall macro level that you have observed change over the last few years?
100%, 100%. And, I could give some educated guesses as to why I think that is. I mean, I think you hit on part of it. 2019, we had Zion and Ja in the NBA, and that created a lot of interest, a lot of media attention in the NBA. And Kyler Murray was the guy in 2019, and he really, as talented as he is, he really didn't hold a candle to Zion and Ja from a media attention standpoint. And then you go into 2020, and you got Burrow, Tua, Hurts, Jordan Love, Justin Herbert. And you go into 2020 in the NBA, and you've got Ant-Man and LaMelo Ball, but it's just not, it kind of flipped the script a little bit. 2020 kind of flipped the script to the NFL. And then I think, 2021 and 2022 obviously didn't have as good of rookie class as 2020, but at the time that 2021 NFL rookie class came out, they were as hyped, if not more hyped, than the 2020 class. And so I think you had the card manufacturers paying attention to what happened in 2020 during the pandemic, and you had the card manufacturers say, okay, we've got an opportunity here to really blow this out, to really put some serious attention into football cards. And you had Panini do a lot of stuff that Panini had never done before, and you had Topps do stuff with Trevor Lawrence, even though Topps didn't have any of the licensing at the time in 2021. I think, Geoff, that combined with the fact that as more and more people flooded the hobby in 2021, which it's a great thing. I think we both agree that's ultimately a great thing. Football's easier to follow. Football is just easier for people to follow. I think that's why fantasy football is more popular than fantasy basketball from a number standpoint, because you've got weekend games. And so I think the average person with responsibilities, with a family, with a career, they can follow it. And so as the market changes game by game and injury by injury and news blurb by news blurb, football is just easier to follow than basketball. So I think those things combined have made football cards more popular, and I definitely am seeing what you're seeing.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. This year is going to be a particularly interesting year, and we're going to get down into breaking down the season and football card plays this season here in a couple of minutes, but the draft this year, back in 2021, as you said, one of the reasons why there was so much hype around that particular year's class was because there were 5 quarterbacks taken in the first round. It was the first time in a long time that had happened. Now, a lot of those quarterbacks haven't actually panned out the way that we hoped that they would, unlike the 2020 football class, where so many of those guys have gone on and become really big stars. But this year, you got 6 who were taken in the first round, setting the all-time record, right? And we're not going to feel the impact of a lot of those players in the football card market this year, because obviously, Drake May's not going to start. Michael Penix may not play much at all. J.J. McCarthy's already out for the entire year. So you're not going to see the full impact of this class for a couple of years, but it is notable. I do want to ask you about Bowman U football cards, because, in our top 5 show this week, for example, we had 2 of the top 5 hottest cards this week that were college players. We had Travis Hunter from Colorado. We had the Cam Ward, the quarterback of the Miami Hurricanes, unfortunately for me, because he had his game against the Florida Gators. Rough weekend for me. But those guys, Shedeur Standards cards have also been hot. There's other college players whose cards are hot. We saw around the NFL draft this last year, players like Drake May, who saw their first Bowman cards shoot up, as he was picked by the Patriots as their, new quarterback of the future. How has that dynamic changed the football card landscape? Do you pay much attention to that, or is that a real investment opportunity as well?
Yeah, Bowman Chrome University has completely changed the game in a few different ways for the football card market. I mean, the biggest thing it's done is it's created way more opportunities for people like me who are looking to essentially make money flipping. And the reason why, and it's also changed the stigma of college cards. So college cards kind of had a stigma a few years back of being lesser than pro cards. And I've landed on a couple different reasons for that. One is that before Bowman Chrome University existed, college cards had a very short runway. You saw Panini Prism draft picks come out right after the NFL draft and maybe be relevant for a couple months, maybe 3 months before pro releases started to come out. Now you have Bowman Chrome University with the college licensing since 2022. Obviously it came out in 2021, didn't have the college licensing. Since 2022, it's had the college licensing. And you have players that you mentioned, Shedeur Sanders, Travis Hunter. You've got guys like Carson Beck at Georgia. And now you have them in their college uniform with the Bowman First logo for a year, 18 months, sometimes 24 months of a runway where they're in college with those cards. So that long runway has allowed there to be an actual real market for those cards to actually be underpriced and then allow someone to prospect on them. And then when we see a performance spike, they go up in price. One guy, Tetaroa McMillan from Arizona this past weekend had 304 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns. His Bowman Chrome First University, First Prospect Auto Raw went from a $20 card this offseason to a $40 card closer to the season to an $80 card after his performance. So it's a real market. It's not as big as the pro market, but it definitely has had an impact on the overall football card market. And I think the biggest thing is there's just there's more places to look, more places to spend your money if you want to try to either collect or make money flipping like I try to do.
Yeah, it's a definite market. And I know some other content creators, Sports Card Dad has talked about how he made a lot of money flipping Bowman Chrome University cards of the guys who were drafted in this year's NFL draft. He was simply buying some of the cards of guys like Drake May in the months leading up to the NFL draft, anticipating that those guys were going to be top 5 picks, top 10 picks. And then the NFL draft hits and he is able to sell some of those cards right away. And all the prices are double all of a sudden. And to a degree, it's kind of like, well, didn't everybody see this coming? But but the sports card market presents opportunities like that all the time. Like there's opportunities to flip a card, anticipating something that's coming down the road that is actually obvious that it's going to go down the road, that it's coming down the road, but collectors aren't necessarily thinking about it or anticipating it or planning in advance for it. And people like you, that's obviously what you do. You think about what's going to happen coming down the road and you anticipate and you spend a lot of time strategizing, and then you try to find opportunities for, to buy low and sell high. So let's talk about this football season, with that in mind. General advice, if you look at the trend lines from the last few seasons, generally you see this peak of football card prices around the start of the season. And then you start to see most football cards go down in price over the course of the season. Not all of them do, but most of them do. You have to be astute. If you're going to actually be buying and selling during the season itself, that's a lot harder. It's easier to buy during the off season. It's easier to buy in February and March when, everybody's seasons are over, and then buy in anticipation of there being a lot of hype around some of these players come, July and August as we're approaching the NFL season. But it's a lot harder to be buying in August or September, or as we get into the season more, October or whatnot, with anticipation that those cards are going to be worth more come November, December, January, because the data shows that's really difficult. And while that is the case with certain players, it's only a small percentage of players. How active are you during the season? Do you think that there are real opportunities that you hop on from a week-to-week basis during the season, or do you see it kind of, fraught with danger?
Since I'm in my 5th year of actually doing this, I will be involved during the season, but all the advice you just gave, everything you just said, I totally validate that 100%, and I've got some data to back it up too. And so I think it's critical. I see more and more new people coming into the hobby, and I love that. And a lot of people, they find the Sports Card Strategy Show and they find nooffseason.com and they tell me, they're excited to buy cards. They've bought into breaks. They want to be maybe buying football cards right now. And I think for people who are trying to navigate the landscape of, okay, when I was a kid, there was Topps and that was it. And then there was Pro Set. And then, there was maybe Leaf and Upper Deck. And then I stopped in the hobby, and now I'm coming back in, and Panini alone has, 50 different brands that they put out. And now Topps has Composite and all this other stuff coming out. They're trying to navigate that. And there's too many different cards, and there's too many different things that happen on a daily basis in the news cycle for new people to try to move in and out and make money during the season. Injuries would be the most obvious one. Underperformance is an obvious one that's going to cause players' pricing to tank during the season. So you nailed it. And before I get into some of the opportunities during the season, I just want to give some data to the audience to back up what you said. So if we look at, I'm going to go backwards from Trevor Lawrence 2021 class and just give a couple examples from 2020 as well. So if we look at Trevor Lawrence 2021 Optic Base PSA 10, that's a $54 card currently. In November and December, that was a $45 card. In February and June, that was a $32 card. So those aren't massive numbers, but when you're trying to move in and out of football cards for a profit, everything matters. Everything adds up. You need those margins. To take a look at another card that's a little bit higher dollar, Joe Burrow's 2020 Optic Holo PSA 10, that's a $482 card currently, as you and I are talking. That was a $360 and $370 card in December, January, and June. So the margin, to your point, is built in when you do it that way. Joe Burrow's 2020 Prism Base, very similar. It's about a $125 card right now. It was a $90 to $100 card in December, a $60 card in January, and basically a $115 card all off season. One more example I'll give, Jordan Love. This is a big one too because Jordan Love's super popular right now. $248 card, his 2020 Optic Holo PSA 10. $248 card right now. Even after Jordan Love was this fledgling starter for the Packers early last year, even after we kind of knew who he was and knew who he was looking like, we saw him beat the Lions on Thanksgiving in a big win. It was a $140 card after that win. It was a $100 to $150 card during the NFL playoffs. And it was a $130 to $150 card in late January through February, and a $173 card in May when we knew who Jordan Love was. It's a $250 card now. So you're absolutely right. If you really want to be playing the game of making money flipping football cards, the most general advice I could give you that actually works is to do what you said. You buy in during those time periods, you're very patient, and then you sell basically right now when everyone's hype about the football season. And so the thing that makes it a little bit trickier, though, as we get into some of the recommendations of where there's opportunities to buy right now, is you got to have the right card for the right player at the right time. You couldn't have just gone and bought any Joe Burrow card during those months, or any Jordan Love, or any Trevor Lawrence card during those months. You would have had to have picked the right card, and you would have had to have known which card has the highest upside. Where can you get the profit when you don't have a performance spike? Where can you get the profit where you just know that the popularity and then the hype of that season starting is going to cause the price to rise? And so that's what I've tried to do at nooffseason.com. It obviously, to your point, takes a little bit more digging into the weeds, digging into the data, which I love to do. So yeah, I definitely brought up some cards that we could talk about where there are still opportunities here in early September for some of the popular names. And the way that I've done that is through something that I've built at nooffseason.com for our premium members called the Formula. So the Formula basically ranks hundreds of cards against each other. So instead of just saying, I think Tua is underpriced right now, and let's go find a card of his that's down, the Formula takes all of the different cards of Tua and ranks them by not only what's down the most, but based on the historical data, what is likely to come up the most, and then ranks them card by card based on ROI percentage and gives you the target cost, because that's the most important thing if you want to buy in right now. You need to know which card to buy, what your target cost should be, and because there's millions of cards to choose from, and we only each have so many dollars to spend, I really wanted to rank them based on what has the highest upside from an ROI percentage.
I'm sure that's some tedious work. We're going to get into that. The general pattern, though, I mean, it does once again kind of seem so predictable and so obvious. I mean, I could have told you that Joe Burrow's cards, for example, you know, he got injured a couple times last season, had a really bad season. When he was playing, he wasn't great. And then he, you know, was out for the season with a hand injury. And to me, it was obvious that if you were to have bought his cards late in the season last year, well after he was out with the injury around the end of the season, that those cards were going to be worth more this year with the season starting, because the Joe Burrow hype would start to build back again come training camp and all that type of thing about how he's going to be back this year. And you know, people are going to get excited about the Bengals prospects again and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of a predictable pattern. You kind of wonder, why don't more people do it if it's predictable? I think part of it comes down to it ties your money up for a long period of time. And, you know, you to be disciplined about it. At first, it is also not that easy to deploy a lot of capital into a particular player necessarily either, because as you said, you only want to buy the right types of cards. And we're going to talk in a minute about what the right types of cards are. But the other thing is you got to buy those cards at a good price. And just because the last comp back in December was, you know, $200 on a card doesn't mean that you can then the next day run out and buy 10 or 20 of those cards at $200 a piece. You're going to struggle to find them, you know, quite potentially at that, right? Like, you know, you see a lot of eBay sellers that have their listings high and they only will negotiate down a certain price point, and maybe they won't go down to most recent comp. You go to a card show and certain dealers will negotiate with you and will be, you know, happy to sell around most recent comp, and other dealers want a 10% premium or something like that. And so it's not easy to acquire cards in volume just because you want to, and to be able to get them all at a good price. And so, you know, there's work involved. Like even if it's obvious, like, yeah, if I could go buy 10 Joe Burrow optic hollow PSA 10s tomorrow, you know, of course I go buy them. And you know, at recent comps, because I know those are going to go up, you know, I'm speaking back in like December, I know those will go up by the start of the football season, but it's going to take some work for you to go find those 10, and get all 10 of them at a fair price, that actually gives you that profit opportunity and potential. And then once you do, as you said, you got to be patient, you got to be disciplined, you got to be willing to stick those cards away in a safe and not look at them again for 8 months. And there's maybe not a lot of people out there willing to do that. And so I think that's part of the reason why more people don't follow maybe that pattern. And so, you know, but for those that will, for those that are like, you know what, I'm going to be disciplined, and this year I'm going to look to buy the cards of the guys who get injured, you know, someone, because undoubtedly one of these top tier quarterbacks is going to be out by week 8 for the rest of the season. And so, we see it happen every year. So, come week 14, after that person's long forgotten about, buy their cards and hold till next season. If somebody listening is willing to do that and willing to be that disciplined and play that game, how do you recommend what cards they should buy? What are the cards then that are going to be the ones that are more likely to go up and be more liquid and sought after come the start of the following football season?
Yeah, I think everything you said is so perfect. And I think ultimately I want people to be patient and disciplined, but I also want people to have fun. And so the way that I have fun is I think of I want to be the one selling the Shedeur Sanders Bowman Chrome first prospect auto PSA 10 after he puts up the big game with Travis Hunter against North Dakota State, right? That is what's fun to me. And that is what I think is fun to the audience of the Sports Card Strategy Show. And I think that if you think of it that way, it makes it a little bit easier to be patient and disciplined. It's kind of in your mindset of, okay, it can be a little bit tedious and boring to try to find the card. And your point about not being able to necessarily find the card for the right price is brilliant, because that's exactly what I try to teach people to do at the Sports Card Strategy Show and at nooffseason.com is there's so many cards, just move on to the next card. You can't find it for the target cost, move on to the next card. So to answer your question, let's talk about what some of those cards are, right? So taking a step back a little bit, how do you get to be the person that lists the card either during the performance spike or just during the hype rise of the season? How do you get to be that person? I think there's two ways that you can do it. And this is where it gets, I think, more fun. And your patience and discipline still needs to happen, but it allows you to, I think, transact more and not necessarily just have to pass and go to the next one because you can't find it for the target price. And that is where you look at what are the three basic ways to make money flipping sports cards in general. So one is card shows, the margin game at card shows. But I'm going to kind of fade that one for the sake of this discussion because we can't all do that. We can't all go to card shows every weekend. And I wanted to build something that anybody could do from anywhere. People with responsibilities, people with families, jobs, things like that. And so then it boils down to two basic ways. Raw to grade, and then buying cards that are already graded. And that seems obvious, right? But now what I've done at nooffseason.com is run as many cards through this formula as possible and try to come up with the ones that have the biggest ROI percentage. So when we look at raw to grade, we want to look at some basic things first. We want to look at what's the lowest entry point of a raw card with the highest upside of a PSA 10. And when you start to do that exercise on your own, and I use market movers for that, at its core, before I start running cards through the formula that I built, I use market movers. I look at, okay, what's the entry point of a Joe Burrow Optic Hollow Raw from 2020? What's the upside of a PSA 10? What's the entry point of a Will Levis Prism Silver from 2023? What's the upside of a PSA 10? The initial beginnings of the formula start to tell you whether or not there's enough upside in a PSA 10 based on the target price of the raw card to even profit at all. And that weeds out a lot of cards. I mean, that alone will weed out usually 80 to 90% of cards. And so then you get to a point where what you end up finding is that you have some base optic and prism and select concourse cards from the top names that will have that upside. And Donruss and some of the other releases, even Mosaic sometimes. But very, very few. When you get to the shorter printed cards, but still mass produced, the Optic Hollows, the Prism Silvers, cards like that, those are cards that are more accessible for the top names, but they give you much more upside in a PSA 10. So generally speaking, those are going to be the cards that you're going to see make sense to go raw to grade on. Sometimes you might have like Prism Lasers, other variations, other parallels of Prism, of Optic, and of Select that might work from a raw to grade standpoint with some upside in a PSA 10. Then, of course, you're probably wondering, okay, you got to cross-reference that with gem rate. You got to cross-reference that with the likelihood of getting all those other grades other than the PSA 10. And you got to build in your shipping cost, your tax on the front end. You got to build in your marketplace fees on the back end. And then that's where you get that whole ROI mathematical equation of, okay, now it makes more sense to buy this card over that card. And you start to see some eye-opening things where you might like a player, but you might see that, and we can get into some specific examples here in a second, but you might see that their Select Concourse PSA 10 does far worse than their optic-based PSA 10, for example. On the already graded side, Geoff, it's riskier. There's risk involved on the raw to grade, of course, because what's out of your hand is what grade are you going to get? You might think that the card looks good. You might do all the pre-grading in the world and prep in the world, and you might think it's going to get a 10, but you're not the grader. You're not the grading company. So that's the risk involved in the raw to grade. The risk involved in the already graded is you got to have a selling marker. You have to see something on the calendar that's coming up for a particular player. You mentioned Joe Burrow being injured last year. That's a good example. Card prices going down because a player's injured. Somebody returning to the field could be a selling marker. The hype leading up to a season could be a selling marker. An early season matchup that we think, Tua and the Miami Dolphins might go off for another 70-point game. That could be a selling marker. So it's there's some of the risk taken out on the grading side if you buy a card already graded, but there's still that risk of injury. Maybe the performance spike doesn't happen. You can't control things in real life. So I'm happy to get into some specific examples of cards, but I just wanted to talk about it at a high level to start.
And Paul, those brands you were talking about, Optic and Prism and Mosaic and Select, being some of the more popular ones from the raw to grade and the possibility of that profit margin being there. What I've also seen with those brands in particular is they also tend to be the most liquid when it comes to going to resell the cards at a later point in time. There's more transaction history on those cards. If you look at Market Movers, you can see very reliable price charts for Prism Base, Prism Silver, Optic Base, Optic Hollow, Select Concourse Base, Select Concourse Silver, both in raw and in graded, because they're popular cards with a lot of transaction volume. Those cards are transacted all the time. Some people, it's interesting to me because people think like, oh, if you're investing in cards, you don't ever want to buy like a Prism Base card. Like that thing's so mass produced and there's thousands of those in a PSA 10 and, hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands raw that are sitting out there. And that is true for long-term thinking, I generally believe. But actually for flipping, those can sometimes be the best cards to flip because the market does move on those cards and the market does move reliably on those cards with a very easy to understand trend line, transaction history, all that type of thing. And even though there's a lot of those on the market, those are oftentimes the ones that start to go up first. And then it's the more rare variants that you start to see the price jumps in later. And I think it's because the base cards are transacted so much that they're almost more responsive to current events, something happening, one of those selling markers, as you just described, because there's, multiple sales every day of the base card in a PSA 10 of a particular player. They can react more quickly, whereas some of the rare parallels and that type of thing, those may only sell once a month or something of that nature. So there's a delay in any type of reaction time. You don't necessarily immediately see the rise the day after the performance because there may just not be a sale for a while. And so, to me, those are cards, not just look at the raw to grade and how they can sometimes get the big multiple, but on top of that, when you do get that PSA 10 to that card, there's a surefire, market for you to turn around and sell that into.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times it's riskier to hold a card long term because you do see the market dip and rise so many times over. And then you start to think, okay, well, if I just executed getting in and out of that market, I could actually make a lot of money. And so with the cards that you described having that high liquidity, that's exactly what we're doing at nooffseason.com and what I like to try to teach people to do. And then I think the point that you made too about, okay, why didn't he talk about Contenders Optic rookie ticket autos? Why didn't he talk about maybe Kabooms or Downtowns? Well, that's because of what you just said, which is those are harder cards to move out of. They are harder cards to sell. They are less transacted. They actually are cards where you kind of do have to thread the needle. You kind of do have to have a huge, massive performance from a player in order to move the needle on a card like that, because there are so few transacted. Even a Joe Burrow Contenders rookie ticket auto from 2020, even in a PSA 10, something that's like very reliable asset, there's only a couple hundred of those. So you're in a situation where it's not going to be transacted multiple times daily or multiple times weekly. It's probably transacted a couple times a month at least. But even then, that's not enough to necessarily make a buyer feel comfortable paying what you might need your buyer to pay in order to profit from that card. So it is harder to move in and out of higher dollar, lower pop cards than it is to move in and out of base cards. Now, I think that the perfect pocket, what I've seen is the Prism Silver, the Optic Hollow, those slightly shorter printed, although still mass produced cards, give the upside of a Contenders rookie ticket auto or a Kaboom at a much lower entry point, and you don't need to see anything. You don't need to see anything out of the ordinary from a player performance standpoint or from hype in the news standpoint for the needle to actually move enough on those cards to make a good amount of money.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that's, if you're in this to flip and you want a simple way of getting in and out of cards and making profit, for me, something like a Prism Silver PSA 10 of any player is a good place to start. Now, for some players, that can be very expensive, so that can be over the budget of, people, when you consider PSA 9 or something of that nature, right? But it's those, to me, I think you're right. I think that's kind of a middle ground sweet spot. Those are not cards that I would really care to hold on to for long-term investment. If I want to buy a Joe Burrow card because I feel like someday he's going to be in the Hall of Fame and I want to be holding that card and give it to my son 30 years from now, I don't want to necessarily hold a Prism Silver. It's just too mass-produced. Although I should say in football, it's less so. Joe Burrow's Prism Silvers, there actually aren't as many of them out there as what you might come to expect. In basketball, you actually see higher print runs on some of that stuff, or at least historically you have. But even still, I'd rather have something a little bit nicer, like a contenders rookie ticket auto or that type of thing. But from a flipping standpoint, I would rather have the Prism Silver. It's going to be easier to move in and out of, easier for people to understand the price history, easier for people to feel like they're getting a fair deal because there's consistency with the price charts and all that type of thing. So we're here on the eve of this football season. Let's get into talking about some of the players, some of the cards that you have your eyes on now. Although we both have agreed that it's hard to make money flipping during the season itself, if someone out there is going to take the chance, who are some of the people you think they should be looking at and why?
Absolutely. I mean, there's always opportunities, and I think that I'll go position by position, and we'll do some raw to grade and we'll do some already graded. And again, if you're listening to Geoff and I right now and you're like, well, you guys are just talking about flipping, I do want to make the point that most of the Sports Card Strategy Show audience flips to fund their PC. So to go back to what Geoff just said, you could use any of this knowledge of transacting in and out of these Prism Silvers or these Optic Hollows or whatever card we're talking about that you might not care about, and you can use the profit to buy a Contenders rookie ticket auto or a Kaboom PSA 10 or something like that for your long-term collection. So, all right, let's get into it. So from a raw to grade standpoint, the formula right now at nooffseason.com tells us that there's a few quarterbacks that you can make some massive ROI on. Now, this is based on current target cost based on current comps. So the people have found these cards recently for this price that I'm about to read off for each card. Obviously, people will say, well, prices could dip on raw cards due to condition. Maybe these have no chance of getting PSA 10s. We totally understand that. I think that the formula from a raw to grade standpoint is built to play the game of buy as many of these as you can, as close to the target cost as possible, and then grade them all. And then you will win overall because the ROI percentage is so high and it is very conservative. It's based on gem rate, but it's also taking out all of your fees on the back end of the sale, but also it includes your fees on the front end of having to pay taxes and shipping. So it's very conservative. So if we look at the top ROI opportunities, let's start with Will Levis from a raw to grade standpoint at quarterback. So this is a good example of how you can use the formula to really make some educated decisions. His 2023 Prism Laser 397 has a $19 raw buy-in point and a $90 upside in a PSA 10. It has about a 61% gem rate. Across all of that data, that's going to yield you about a 27% ROI after fees. So you might be thinking, okay, 27%, not bad. This is where I think the formula really helps you, is that his Prism Silver only has an $11 more of a buy-in point. So it's a $30 target cost based on recent comps for Will Levis's raw Prism Silver. Again, the move here is going to be to try to find gradable copies as close to that target cost as possible. You're not going to get all 10s. It has a lower gem rate, a 48% gem rate, but a much higher upside in a PSA 10 of $204. So that's going to give you a likelihood of a 74% ROI. So if you're looking to profit on football cards right now, that is a good raw to grade play. The risk, of course, is that Will Levis underperforms while your card is at the grading company, and that PSA 10 upside comes down. Of course, he could perform very well. He could exceed expectations. We don't know yet. And that PSA 10 upside could go up. If you want to go a little bit safer in terms of names that will hold more value long term, because I think if Will Levis underperforms, maybe he's got a short leash. Guys like Tua and Joe Burrow probably have a longer leash. So Tua's Optic Hollow Raw has a current target cost of about $21 based on recent comps. It has a pretty high upside in a PSA 10 and of about $155, $160. So when you're looking at that raw to grade play at a 60+% gem rate, that's $102 ROI on Tua if you can stick to that target cost close to $21. Now 2020, might have been picked over a little bit. So everything has risk, right? None of this is a surefire bet. Joe Burrow's 2020 Optic Hollow Raw has an entry price of $151, much higher upside in PSA 10, closer to $500. So you've got a 45% gem rate, so a 57% ROI, conservatively based off all the grades you're likely to get on those cards. One more thing, Geoff, that we haven't mentioned that is very, very relevant to buying football cards during the season, and that's the backup QB strategy. Yeah. Do we all know the backup QB strategy?
Yep.
So the backup QB strategy is risky. You can spread yourself too thin trying to because no one can predict who's going to go down. No one can predict the next Josh Browning, Cooper Rush, Mike White, where their cards skyrocket based on the starter going down. However, if you look at a guy like Hendon Hooker, who has some pretty decent draft capital from 2023, third round pick for the Lions, from a raw to grade standpoint, there are 3 Hendon Hooker cards that make sense to me. His 2023 Prism Silver at about $18, his Prism Rookie Variation No Huddle at about $20, and his Optic Hollow at about $5, all have ROI percentages of over 35% up to 60% from a raw to grade standpoint. And so what I like about that play, if you want to go backup QB strategy and you want to prospect on Jared Goff getting injured, which is a weird thing to do, but it happens in our line of work, so to speak, you can look at a guy like Hendon Hooker who you buy his cards, you send him off to the grading company of your choice, you hope for that upside based on the formula, and then even if something doesn't happen to Jared Goff, you still have that upside in his PSA 10, and you have the upside of maybe him coming in and being the starter. And then the other way that I would play the backup QB strategy is I would look at guys like worst case scenario, who's going to perform well next preseason? If you can have that discipline and patience, who's going to perform well next preseason? And I think a guy like Hendon Hooker will be that guy. So I've talked for a long time on this. I have many, many more plays that I could talk about, but I'll pass it back over to you, Geoff, to see if we want to get into some other skill position players or where we want to go next with the opportunities for this year.
No, I think that's a good call. One of the earlier videos I did for Sports Card Investor back in 2019 was I did a video specifically about a backup quarterback strategy, and it was early in that football season. And I recommended during that video, I said, buy Teddy Bridgewater cards and buy Mason Rudolph cards. And that was, of course, late in Drew Brees' career and late in Ben Roethlisberger's career. And I said, look, if either of these guys get injured, they're both, approaching 40 years old. If either of these guys get injured, Bridgewater would come in for Brees, or obviously Rudolph would come in for Big Ben, and their cards are going to go up significantly. And wouldn't you believe it? I posted that video on like a Tuesday or Wednesday, and that Sunday, both of those guys went down with injury, and they were both out for several weeks, maybe the whole season. I can't quite recall, but both Mason Rudolph and Teddy Bridgewater both came into the game. Both of them saw their card prices spike. And so it is a strategy I'm familiar with. Now, that's a short-term strategy, not a long-term. What's ironic now is that sometimes people call up those clips and they make fun of me, saying during that, they pull up that video from 2019 where I said, I think there's opportunity with Teddy Bridgewater. I think there's opportunity with Mason Rudolph. And they play that now like I was recommending some crazy, a silly quarterback recommendation. And I'm like, you fools. People who listened to that back in 2019 after I put that video out made so much money. Like it worked out perfectly at that moment. And it's just like, Hendon Hooker, who knows if he's still going to be in the league in 5 years, but is there a short-term opportunity over the course of this season or going into next preseason? As you said, yeah, there certainly is with a guy like Hendon Hooker. So, you're not thinking here, you're not predicting that Hendon Hooker is going to be a Hall of Famer or is even going to be a starter in 5 years. You're just simply saying that there's probably opportunity between now and the start of next preseason, with a quarterback like that. And I think that is true, particularly if you can get into his cards for $5, as you said, raw to grade. Those are inexpensive cards right now. And I also like the raw to grade strategy with a guy like him better than some of the previous guys you mentioned, like a Joe Burrow or a Tua rookie. And the reason why is because with a guy like Burrow, his cards are already so valuable and they've been out for so long that I'm pretty skeptical buying any raw Joe Burrow rookie cards at this moment in time, because they probably have already been inspected by at least one dealer or collector along the way to see if it's grade worthy. Whereas Hendon Hooker's cards, they're still being pulled out of packs right now, and they're lower priced. So there may be a lot of people that even if they pull one and they're like, that's gem mint worthy, they still may not bother to grade it just because it's not Joe Burrow, right? And so there's, I think your chance of success employing a raw to graded strategy on somebody like Hendon Hooker right now is probably a lot higher in terms of the percentage of gems you can get back. And so that's exciting too. So for all those reasons, I think you're definitely onto something there. Quarterbacks are the most popular, but you mentioned other skill position players. Just give me a couple of guys: running back, receiver, maybe tight end, or somebody else perhaps you have your eye on.
Yeah, from a raw to grade standpoint, guys, Jahmyr Gibbs, Prism Silver, he's from 2023, to your point, still likely being pulled out of some packs, even though it's been out for, 7-8 months now. Devon Achane as well. So their raw to grade entry level prices are around $10 for their Prism Silvers, and upside in a PSA 10 around between $70 and $90, depending on the player that you pick. So their ROI percentage is over 25%. So they're, I would say, quote unquote, the safer, even though nothing is truly safe, but they're the safer raw to grade plays from a running back standpoint. Jahmyr Gibbs also already graded in a PSA 10, $32 base. So that's not the silver. So the silver would be the recommendation for the raw to grade. The base PSA 10, $32. Looking at now what you need for that is the Detroit Lions to make it far into the playoffs. That's what you need for that card to double in price. If that happens, which I'm horrible at predicting whether or not that's going to happen. But if you like that game, if you're out there thinking, hey, I want to place a little prop bet on the Lions, that's a good card to buy. Already graded in a PSA 10 would give you a 50% ROI. Pass catchers from a raw to grade standpoint, Drake London's 2022 Prism Silver, $4 buy-in point, $75 upside in a PSA 10. That's going to get you about a 55% ROI. And then a good example, another pass catcher from a raw to grade standpoint, where you can't, this is another point I wanted to make, you can't really just say, I like this player. You really do have to look at the card. Sam Laporta, his 2023 Prism Silver from a raw to grade standpoint is going to get you a 63% ROI, where his Prism Laser does not have the upside in a PSA 10 that the Silver does currently. So that's actually a negative ROI, even though, so there's some opportunities with Sam Laporta. Real quick on the already graded side, pass catchers, Geoff, Brandon Ayuk 2020 Optic Hollow PSA 10 is a $47 card right now. Last September, closer to a $100 card. No reason why a performance spike wouldn't be coming for Brandon Ayuk. 60% ROI on that. And then we've got two other receivers. No reason why we wouldn't see their cards go up and later on this month from where they are now. Jamar Chase, 2020 Optic Hollow PSA 10, $70 card right now. Should easily, but should be over $100. Pretty much potentially over $120 card later this month. That's a 37% ROI. And then last year's hot name, Puka Nacua, his 2023 Prism Silver PSA 10, $120 card. A little bit harder to go back and get historical data on him. But when you look at second-year wide receivers who were the top wide receiver as a rookie, we use historical data from guys like Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase going into their second year for a guy like Puka Nacua. And then we come up with close to a $200 upside in September. So from a raw to grade or from an already graded standpoint, buying Puka Nacua's Prism Silver PSA 10, there's upside in that $120 buy-in point right now. Close to 30% ROI is what the formula projects there.
Any quarterbacks in terms of the already graded that you think, maybe they come out hot or maybe they got a playoff run in them and maybe seem a little undervalued right now based on historicals or other guys around them?
The best already graded quarterbacks, I'm so glad you asked, the best already graded quarterbacks, and I'll give some specific cards, but they are Justin Herbert, Jared Goff, Tua, and Josh Allen. Those are the four best. If you want to go buy already graded PSA 10s of quarterbacks, those are the best. Reason being, Justin Herbert, $31 buy-in point for his select field level PSA 10. That's projected to be a $75 card in about 4 to 6 weeks based on historical data. Herbert's Prism base PSA 10, $77 card. That's expected to double based on historical data in 4 to 6 weeks. Jared Goff, Optic base PSA 10, is his best card to buy now. That's going to be, to your point earlier, super hard to find it at the $65 buy-in point, but the most recent comp, $65. So if you can get it for close to that, there's upside. That should go up to $100+ card in the next 4 to 6 weeks. A little less upside in Goff's Select Concourse PSA 10, but still at a $53 target cost, you can make money there. Tua has, I'm not going to read them all off, but Tua has several cards. His base Donruss PSA 10, his Mosaic NFL debut PSA 10, believe it or not, his Donruss Canvas PSA 10, his Select Concourse PSA 10, and his Prism base PSA 10 all have margin later on in September. And then Josh Allen, his 2018 Optic base PSA 10 has 11% margin, and his Select Premier Level Silver PSA 10 has 45% upside. That's a $250 buy-in point right now. In late September last year, projected this year to be close to a $450 or $500 card based on historical data.
Now, of course, that is for those prices to be realized. These guys do have to come out. They have to stay injury free. They have to perform well. They got to put up numbers. Their teams have to win games. So there's a lot of risk in all of this, right? And just because the historical data says a card could go in a certain direction, it doesn't mean that it will. But hopefully, if it does, more times than not, you don't have to be right 100% of the time. You only have to be right, a little over half the time, and you're probably doing all right for yourself in this stuff.
Geoff, I mean, to be honest, I'm probably only right 30% of the time, but the other 70% of the time, I'm buying these cards that I'm breaking even on. And so if I'm breaking even 70% of the time because things don't materialize the way they should, or I have to be a little bit more patient before I sell them because of the market. When you buy a name like the ones we've mentioned, in the last segment there of the already graded quarterbacks, those are guys that even if they do get injured, even if they do underperform, their prices will at least bounce back to the point where you're not going to get slaughtered on the buy-in price because you bought them at the target cost. So yeah, that's how I can be right only 30% of the time on this. And the profit that I'm making from the 30% is making it worth the rest of the 70. So I'm glad you said that, because expectations management is a big part of this. It's a big part of what I do with the audience of the Sports Card Strategy Show and the premium members at nooffseason.com. It's training people to understand you're not going to win all the time. Everything's not going to always go your way. It's going to go your way about 30. You're going to have that Hall of Fame, 1 for 3 at the plate, to use that baseball analogy. And these tools and these patterns are going to help you do that, but they're not going to ensure that you're going to win on every single card. That's just not possible.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that makes a lot of sense. But if you can get those occasional home runs, then and not take too big of a loss on the others, break even on the others, or get out of them with a small loss, then the numbers over time add up. And if you do it enough, they can add up successfully. Paul, you've covered a lot of ground, and I know we've already been talking for a bit. I want to make sure before we wrap up that you can tell the audience a little bit more about what you do. You mentioned your podcast and your website a few times, so let the audience know about that.
Sure. So if you're looking for some helpful information for free every week, Sports Card Strategy Show is a great place to be. YouTube.com/Paul Hickey is where you can watch it. It's on Apple and Spotify if you want to be doing other things, working out, walking the dog, hanging out with friends, whatever, driving. It's a good listen. And that's probably where most people consume my content. And then for those of us that are a little bit more intense and really want to hone in on being a practitioner of all of this, nooffseason.com, you can get a free 30-day trial of everything I've talked about. You can get the formula-based sports card rankings. We also have Sports Card School, which there's a lot of tips and tricks for first-time eBay sellers, first-time buyers of cards trying to navigate the hobby after re-entering after 20, 30 years, or just coming in for the first time. So Sports Card School at nooffseason.com. And then if you're just more casual and you want to check me out on Instagram, Sports Card Strategy, and just really appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk to you, Geoff. And I think for people who are kind of looking at this and going, okay, this entire conversation was about flipping sports cards, getting in and out. I will say this. I want people to stay in the hobby. And what I saw initially when I got back into the hobby after 30 years in late 2020, and what I still see to this day, is I see a lot of passionate people coming in, getting really excited, getting really overwhelmed, losing money, and then leaving. And I'm just trying to prevent that. I'm trying to give people, in my own way, a good experience when they come in, a helping hand of, even if it's saying, don't buy this card, don't do this. First, look at the landscape. Sports Card Strategy Show, nooffseason.com. Great places to just come in, check it out, learn before you start buying, and just, I think that increases the chances of people staying in the hobby for the long term versus just coming in, getting excited, spending a lot of money, being like, I can't do this every week, and then leaving.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's definitely a good mission. We want, a lot of new people are coming in the hobby these days, which is wonderful, but we want them to have a good experience and certainly make the right move. So appreciate you doing that, Paul, and appreciate you joining the show today. This has been insightful, and we got football season. Football, going to start getting to watch it every single day here starting tomorrow. So hope you enjoy the season, Paul, and hope everything you buy into this year does real well for you.
Thanks, Geoff. You too. Go Gators and go Michigan State Spartans.
There you go. The Gators need a little help. Hopefully it's a better season for Michigan State than it has been for us so far. Appreciate you, Paul. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, Geoff.
All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed my interview with Paul, and I wanted to remind you that the full-length episode of these Geoff Wilson shows are not only available on YouTube, on the Geoff Wilson Show channel on YouTube, but they're also available on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts, so make sure you are subscribed everywhere. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you with our next episode soon. Take care.